From the KSL Broadcast House, this is Sunday Edition with Doug Wright.
And good morning to you. Thank you for joining us on Sunday Edition. This week, we'll be talking with BYU Professor of Ecology, Ben Abbott, about how all of this moisture is affecting the levels of the Great Salt Lake and what water conservation measures are being taken to help preserve this water for future years. And we'll be sitting down with the chair of the Community Ballpark Committee about what the future holds for the home of the Salt Lake Bees. But first, Hillary Koellner is here with us with the Department of Public Safety. We're here to talk about some really bad stuff that's happening with these hoaxes and school threats that are going on. Welcome back to the program, Hillary. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Doug.
Let's talk about what is happening. Give us a little thumbnail sketch of what has transpired.
I think the reason we're talking about this again, it's because we gave a legislative update, right, about the hoax calls that we had March 29th. We had over 10 calls to non-emergency lines that claimed there was an active shooter in these schools,
right,
which kind of threw the public into panic mode, especially with all of the different information going out through social media, speculation that went through. But what we were able to find is that these were hoax calls. Luckily, some of the resource officers within the schools were able to verify this quickly. We were able to alert dispatch centers of the similarities of the calls and kind of go through that process. But they all came from an IP address. So it was not a call that was physically made by a phone number. Right. It was from an IP address, and the FBI has been able to track that IP address overseas. So right now, they have taken the lead over the investigation. So as the state and also the local agencies that were involved, we are just providing all the information they need for this.
Right. I know with an ongoing investigation, no law enforcement agency, certainly the FBI, wants to talk about too much. So if I ask anything that is inappropriate, we certainly understand that you can't answer. But what do we know? I mean, is there anything behind the motivation of this, or the schools that were targeted? Was it random? What do we know at this point that we can talk about?
Right. At this point, what we know is that the caller or the individual or individuals that may have done this did their homework because they called non-emergency lines. This was for very obvious reasons, because if you call 911, all 911 centers have very high technology that can track down location, and it'll actually redirect calls to the appropriate place in 911 centers based on your geolocation. But we were able to find that there were inconsistencies with the calls made, right? So there were mispronunciations of the schools, or certain things that were said within that call. Once the dispatcher started asking more questions, the caller hung up, right?
Yeah.
So when the caller felt like maybe they were caught or threatened because they didn't know what more information to give, the calls dropped. Now, motivation, we really don't know. Like I mentioned, the FBI has taken over that. But in the past, or at least right now in Utah, all of the hoax calls for active shooters in schools have either been through a social media trend or post, or they have been this specific March 29th event.
You know, often when somebody gets a phone call, regardless of where it is, institution, government, or individuals, there's a money motivation behind it. You know, they're trying to get pertinent information, they're trying to get account numbers, and so on. It's hard to fathom what was going on here.
Yeah, it's still under investigation, but the one thing that we would like to make sure people know, especially young students, that in the past we have seen some of those hoax calls, not necessarily to this event, but come from social media. They don't realize the effect of a hoax call on an active shooter, right? This isn't just something that comes and goes and it's not a funny act. It affects people's lives. It affects the students in that school, the teachers, the administration, the family members, because to them it was real. It was very much real for the time that they didn't know what was happening.
Well, on a very practical side, too, I always recall a speech that former Governor Leavitt made once. It was either a State of the State or it was an inaugural address. And he talked about how much, first of all, better, simpler, and less expensive our lives would be if we just, he called it the economy of goodness, if people were just honest and so on. And what I think many people don't fully realize, you mentioned wow, can you imagine being a parent and, you know, the administrators of schools in there, but law enforcement and the hours that is being spent investigating this, reacting to things, the built-up emotions and being on alert.
Yeah.
There's such a cost, emotional, physical, monetary cost to this.
Definitely. I mean, one of the biggest effects from hoax calls is the financial aspect of things. It involves law enforcement, emergency medical services,
right,
firefighters, as well as administrative, right? If we think back about the Granite School incident, I think every agency in the state collaborated with that, which is great to know that our law enforcement their number one goal is public safety,
right,
and they're all willing to show up when in the time of need like that. But at the same time, when you're thinking about the financial aspect of things, administrative,
huge.
For something that somebody thought maybe was a mistake, or especially for the people that do it because they think it's a joke.
A hoax, yeah.
We definitely want to discourage all of that. And I mean, hopefully now that HB 61 passed this last legislative session, we're going to the Department of Public Safety will be creating a new division dedicated to school safety, where we're going to have a school safety chief, and it's going to be another member of law enforcement that's going to overlook a curriculum that we can have a standard practice to answer to these type of calls, and also kind of how to get to the source earlier to see if it is a hoax, to see if it's something very much real.
It'll be interesting to see where this investigation goes and what ultimately shakes out, and when it ends up being a source offshore. You kind of wonder what ultimately can and will we do about it. But I certainly appreciate the insights that you could share, and thank you so much for being with us this morning on Sunday Edition.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you so much. We'll be right back. We're going to be talking about how all of the recent moisture is affecting particularly the Great Salt Lake. Stay with us. And welcome back. We're being joined right now by Zoom, BYU Ecology Professor Ben Abbott, and Professor Abbott has been our guest before here on Sunday Edition. Professor, let's talk about this record-breaking year for moisture, at least for most of us in memory, in the state of Utah, and the rain. I've really been surprised. I have yet to turn on any sprinklers or anything, but has this been enough to really help the drought situation that we've been in for so long, but especially, as we were talking about last time we chatted, the Great Salt Lake?
Yeah, this winter has been just an incredible blessing. The most snowfall on record since we started this, even before you were born, if you can believe that. The Great Salt Lake has come up several feet. We're between 4 and 5 feet above where it was last fall. That's really important because we were at an all-time low, and we were starting to see a real breakdown of that ecosystem where the food web, the birds, also the industry, and the public health benefit of suppressing that toxic dust, we were losing all of that. And we're not yet back where we want to be. This really rolls the clock back a couple of years, but to make sure that we have a healthy Great Salt Lake long-term, we've got to reduce our water consumption. We've got to learn to live within our means. This is really helpful, and it lets us get out in front of this problem rather than always attacking it from behind.
I've lived in Utah my entire life, born and raised right here along the Wasatch Front. And I've learned so much more about the ecosystem associated with the Great Salt Lake. My grandfather used to love to hunt ducks, and we'd be out in the marshlands and so on. I was aware of that and the bird refuge and so on. But I really wasn't fully aware of it. It gets right down to those brine flies that we love so much, that the birds love to eat, the brine shrimp. And I understand that even just having the water that we have now, having the salt levels within the water has really taken a little stress off those brine shrimp out there.
That's right. Sometimes people compare the Great Salt Lake with the Dead Sea in Israel, but the two water bodies are very different. Great Salt Lake is alive. It's a thriving ecosystem. And last year, the salinity, the salt level was getting so high that it was starting to kill those brine flies and keep the brine shrimp from being able to reproduce. And so that threatened the whole system. the lake has reached the level that it was at in 2021. So again, we've gone back about 2 years. We need to be looking to the future now, because the big snow has replenished the soil moisture, and it's obviously increased the river flow, right? Many of us are even experiencing flooding in our communities. But the two reservoirs that it hasn't refilled so far is the groundwater below our feet, and we're still in a pretty rough situation there, and then the Great Salt Lake itself. And the only way we're going to refill those really big and important water reservoirs is by reducing our consumption.
As you mentioned, having this lake, and when you think of the surface of the lake and how relatively shallow it is, to have it up by 4 or 5 feet, I can't even imagine, the acre feet of water that involves.
Yeah, we're going to see millions of acre feet of water that make it to the lake this year, and compare that with last year, where we didn't even get 1 million acre feet of water into it. It is an enormous water body. It's the largest saline lake in the Western Hemisphere. So it takes a lot of water to move things even an inch.
Before we move on to what we can do to conserve, boy, I heard some real interesting numbers even down south, and of course from the Colorado River drainage system, that Lake Powell is going up in the last little while, about 1 foot a day. Even one day it went up 14 inches. And again, when you think of the surface of that body of water, that is just almost beyond calculation and imagination for somebody like me.
It is. These are the water cycle. The global water cycle is the biggest movement of material in the entire Earth system. And we measure it in thousands and millions of cubic kilometers of water. It's just an enormous thing. It's also why we've got to make sure that we are controlling what we can, which is mainly on our consumption side. It's not the kind of thing that we can just flip a switch and make more water. These are huge forces outside of our control. We've got to exercise those conservative traditional principles of living within our means with what is sustainably available.
I really like that, consuming water within our means. And we're all looking at the amazing water we've had, the rise in the lake and so on. But yet, as you mentioned, we've basically rewound ourselves to 2021. We've gained a little breathing room. So what can the average Utahn do to really help this situation?
There is thankfully a lot that we can do. Utah ranks in the top 1 to top 3 in per capita water consumption each year. And some of that's not our fault, right? We need to use more water to do things that in other places come naturally. But we have a lot of room for improvement. The state has rolled out a lot of resources, and you can find, they've compiled all of that at the Utah Water Savers website. If you just type in Utah Water Savers in your web browser, that'll pop right up. There are programs that can help you reduce the amount of water you're using outdoors by reducing the area of turf grass and transitioning to other things. You can even keep the turf grass that you have, but install a smart water controller. It's estimated by some of the water conservancy districts that we're irrigating about twice as much as we need for the outdoor vegetation that we have. Lush turf grass requires about 25 inches of water a year. The average amount right now is around 60 that we're putting on our lawns. And so with one of these smart controllers, or as you mentioned at the beginning of the segment, don't turn on your sprinklers until the grass really needs it. That actually trains your grass to sink its roots deeper, and you end up with a more resilient, a drought-resilient lawn. So it's really important to focus on that outdoor water use piece, because that's what's consuming the water that otherwise would be able to flow downstream to Utah Lake, our rivers, and Great Salt Lake.
Professor, it's always fun to talk with you. Ben, I appreciate you being with us here on Sunday Edition, and it will be most interesting to see where we end up at the end of the summer and what kind of rain we have and everything else. But thank you so much for letting us tap into your knowledge.
Thank you, Doug.
Be sure to stay with us, because we'll be right back to talk about the community getting a say in the future home of the Salt Lake Bees and what will happen to the old, I still think of it as Dirks Field, shows you how old I am, but the Smith Ballpark. That's coming up. Stay with us. Thanks for staying with us today on Sunday Edition. Our final guest on the program, the Ballpark Community Chair, Amy Hawkins. And the community is getting a say on what happens to the old ballpark in the Salt Lake area. I've been around long enough now. I remember when it was Dirksfield. I remember when it was the Bees. Everything happened there. It was either Liberty Park or it happened at Dirksfield, and everything from fireworks to ball games. I mean, you name it. And now the community has a chance, now that the Bees will be moving to Daybreak. What is going to happen, and what kind of a say do we have in what will happen to what we now know as the Smiths Ballpark?
Well, it's pretty exciting. You know, the city decided to launch a design contest to generate ideas and conversation.
Right.
And so that's great. There's real momentum happening. And so right now we're down to 9 finalist proposals, 3 from design professionals, 3 from secondary students, you know, folks in college, and
right.
then 3 from residents. And so right now, the city is inviting everybody to vote through May 25th to cast their vote in each of those 3 categories to vote on what they think would, you know, most benefit the community, I hope.
Right, right. You know, I've seen some talk about what each plan might be, even some renditions of what it might be. What are the potentials? It could be from A to Z. What could it be? I've even heard soccer there.
Oh, definitely, yeah. There's some of these designs involve a lot of sports still involved, which
right.
is exciting for the sports fans in the neighborhood. Some involve a little bit of housing, some involve green space, and a lot involve adaptive reuse of the stadium structure, that iconic ballpark right. stadium. And they're adapting it in different ways. Some are thinking about putting shops in that space. Some folks are thinking about that stadium and making it into concert space. Others are saying, let's build a garden and green space on top of the stadium. There are a lot of creative ideas.
I was going to ask about because based on my perspective, this is still a fairly new facility. It's certainly, although it's been around forever, I know, but compared to what used to be there. But it is beautiful. And as a matter of fact, KSL Radio celebrated its 100th birthday a year ago, and we did some of it at the Smiths Ballpark in the Bees game there. And every time I go in there, it still looks so cool to me. And then the view is spectacular. Now, fortunately, almost all of our stadiums have spectacular views of the mountains, and every commentator from outside the state of Utah raves about just how spectacular things are here in our state. And so I have to admit, I'm heartened that the old bleachers might stay.
Yeah, I keep hearing that being called the best view in minor league baseball.
Absolutely.
Right? I can't think of not wanting to preserve that for some use, whether it's, you know, future sports fans or some kind of community use, folks enjoying a concert or shopping at a farmer's market. You know, those are some beautiful views that we'd like to continue to see.
What about the neighborhood itself? That's such an iconic neighborhood. As a matter of fact, an old family home in my family from my mother's side, the actual side of the old house is actually under the freeway on 9th. And so the home sat right under where the freeway exit goes right now. But that's a wonderful neighborhood with rich, rich heritage and a real interesting mix of everything.
I agree.
Yeah.
I love living there.
Yeah.
I live a block south of the stadium myself.
Oh, see, I wasn't aware of that.
Oh, yes, I'm proud to.
Well, no wonder you're the chair.
I'm proud to represent the community I live in and the folks who enjoy living and working and having their businesses in that community.
Right. Are folks excited about what's happening, or are they really disappointed the ballpark is not going to be the traditional ballpark anymore?
You know, I think there's a real mix of emotions. We had a community meeting in March to sort of let folks air out their feelings, and Public Coffee in the neighborhood hosted that meeting. We had about 150 people there, and folks got to sort of talk about their hopes and fears. Right. Some of those hopes were about what could happen to the stadium site, but some of it was, you know, they're afraid that it would just turn into high-rise apartments, and just that we would lose the sense of specialness, the regional draw, the voice that having something really special gives us in that neighborhood. So it's not just about losing the tradition of baseball in the neighborhood, it's losing the sense of celebration. But we have seen a lot of proposals that seem like they could give us something like that back, or you know, give us something forward-facing that would allow something like that to continue. So I'm optimistic that we might be able to turn forward towards the future in a good way.
Quite a few years ago, sometimes I'm invited to speak to groups, and for probably at least the last 20 years, I say, after we take care of meat and potatoes, I get that there are absolute practicalities, but the things that are most important to me nowadays are, first of all, our heritage, our architecture, our culture, everything like that, mass transportation and open space. And you're at the epicenter of that. That ballpark is such a historic neighborhood, wonderful architecture. You've got tracks going right through there, and we've got this potential. As a baseball field, it certainly has been open green space, but boy, what we do with that in the future is so important.
How can I disagree with that, right? There's so much opportunity right there. As a neighborhood, though, we're kind of underserved when it comes to open green space.
Right.
So it's sort of strange that we have that beautiful open green field that we see depicted in pictures so often, but when you think about the amount of public green space that the neighborhood has access to, if you look at, you know, city surveys, we're actually underserved.
Right.
So it seems important, from my perspective as a community leader, to look for an opportunity for the community to have access.
It hasn't exactly been an open sandlot for baseball, exactly. Okay, very quickly, we're almost out of time. How can people get more information and voice their opinion?
Oh, that's easy. Ballparknext.com.
Even I remember that.
I know, isn't it great?
Ballparknext.com.
I love that.
There we go.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for caring about our neighborhood and giving this opportunity to discuss it some more.
Oh, it's my pleasure, believe me. Thank you again. And thank you to all of you for joining us on Sunday Edition. We hope you'll join us. Well, actually, next week, we're taking the week off. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Music and the spoken word. That's coming up next.